Good morning again and welcome. If you're joining us now in the room or joining us online just now, we are at Politico's AI and Tech Summit. I'm Laurens Cyrullis. I'm the cybersecurity editor and deputy tech editor at Politico. I have the pleasure to moderate a discussion on a very topical theme, which is Europe's quest for tech sovereignty. First, let me just run through a quick logistics note. Those of you following in the room, there will be an opportunity to ask a few questions. We'll be getting to that near the end of the session. If you want to prepare your questions, that's very helpful. Please keep them snappy, keep them short. Don't make statements, ask questions. And please indicate who you are and which organization you're representing. I also want to remind our audience online and here in the room that you can also engage on social media, X, Blue Sky, LinkedIn, those of your choice, using the hashtag #PoliticoAITech. So let's turn to the theme. Tech sovereignty is not a new concept in Brussels. It's been talked about for some years, some decades even. But there is a change in that conversation. We started the day yesterday by explaining how the international and European context politically has changed dramatically, and that has had a real impact on how we discuss tech sovereignty among European policymakers and decision makers. That goes from what the Draghi report said about the state of our economy and our competitiveness with the rest of the world, to the new European Commission coming into place, which has identified tech sovereignty as one of its key priorities and named the commissioner, Executive Vice President Henna Virkkunen, to lead this file. She's currently in the US trying to do exactly that. Two, obviously, the Trump administration that came into place about 100 years ago, about 100 days ago. Sure, that's a Freudian slip, I think. It sure feels like 100 years ago. But about 100 days ago, and that has obviously had a massive impact on how we have this discussion on tech sovereignty. I've been covering technology for a couple of years now. We used to talk a lot about China last year, the year before that. Now all of our discussions seem to be centered around our relationship with the United States. That's not the whole discussion, obviously, but it is a big part of our discussion. I'm delighted to have fantastic speakers with me on the stage to discuss this topic. Let me introduce them. So Lucilla Scioli is the director of the EU's AI office at the European Commission. Thomas Coulpe is Director General at the Directorate General for Enterprise, which is part of the Ministry of Economy and Finance in France. We have Cristina Cafara, economist and honorary professor at the University College of London, which I think once Politico called the high priestess of antitrust, but I understand you've moved on from antitrust and are now deep into technology. And we've got Alexandre Roer, head of policy and deputy head of office at the Computer and Communications Industry Association, which we at Politico like to call Big Tech Association. CCIA doesn't really like that, but they represent some of the biggest players in the technology landscape, and some others. I want to start the discussion with this question of what has changed in our discussion on technology sovereignty. From a year ago, from 2 years ago, the discussions we're having today are fundamentally different. The question is, why are they fundamentally different? And Lucilla, I prepared you. I hope you had the time, but I want to ask you to answer that question with one word. What has changed?
Well, you just asked me outside now, so I cannot say that I'm prepared. It's a tough question. If I answered the word has changed, it wouldn't be a correct answer because you asked me only about the last 1 year. And the world has been started to change some time ago with the wars and everything else. So I think I will answer that in the last year, there is maybe greater awareness of the importance of being sovereign from the technological point of view, an idea which was already there before, because I think you can remember that the European Commission was already working on these issues. We did the CHIPS Act, we did many activities that were really also trying to make us stronger in areas where we had clear weaknesses. and make us in particular more resilient, the work we did on the supply chains in general. So that started already some time ago. And if you ask me more in the recent term, I would think it's really greater awareness of the issue in society as well, and the importance of technological sovereignty also for society.
I'll take awareness as the one word.
Yeah.
Yeah, does that work? Christina, you're quite good at phrasing things short and snappy, so how about one word on what has changed?
Colony. Okay, awareness, we are a colony in digital. Do I need to say more? Do I expand?
I would love you to explain that a little bit, yes.
So you asked for one word. Let me start by saying thank you for having me here. And in the spirit of disclosure, I used to be one of the few in the world of antitrust who disclosed who my clients are. I'm happy to report I have nothing to disclose. I'm not lobbying. I don't represent anyone, and I'm not paid a cent by anyone for saying what I do, what I say, or doing what I do. Important framing. What has changed, as you say, are three things, essentially. Draghi, Trump, and the awareness that we have a position of entire dependency, in addition to which I would also add the awareness that antitrust and regulation aren't working, okay? So they're nice to have. They're making some progress. I wouldn't suggest we repeal them, but we know as much as anyone that antitrust enforcement in digital has not delivered in terms of changing market structure, creating power for Europeans, and that regulation as well-intentioned as it is exactly in the same mold. It is nice to convince ourselves somehow we're taming big tech and have some emojis with flexi biceps, but the reality is that we are not. And number two, whatever it is that we're doing is not elevating European industry, European capabilities, European assets. And so the real motivation for strategic autonomy is the realization that whatever it is that we've been doing in the last few years in antitrust and regulation has not created that level playing field, has not supported and empowered European industry. We are not incompetent or incapable. We used to be leaders in technology 20 years ago. What happened to us? Did we roll into a ball and fall under the sofa? Have we lost the capability to do that? It is inconceivable. When you talk to business in Europe, there is cloud, there is software, there is all sorts of capabilities, and we somehow appear resigned to have become a colony. And this is not tenable in the current geopolitical environment.
And just to close that thought, if you say colony, it is a loaded term, but you also have to specify who the colonial power is.
Well, I mean, the majority of the power comes from the United States because they're very good. Let me just say, I have no anti-American sentiment. These companies, and some used to be my clients, are exceptionally good at what they do. So I don't have a problem there. But it doesn't mean that we need to absolutely marginalize ourselves and resign ourselves as Europeans to be so dependent, because dependency is not tenable in the current environment. We've been thrown out overboard by Donald Trump in terms of our alliances on one day, on 28th of February, when Zelensky was bullied in the White House. So exactly what else do we need to really see to get on the move?
Alexander, I know you have perspectives on the element of colony. I just want to bring you in, but first, if I can turn to Thomas. Thomas, the French government obviously has been working on the concept of strategic autonomy for a while. It's now in vogue with an English word that is derived from French, so that works. Can you tell us how you feel that campaign on strategic autonomy, how that is working today, and whether that's more successful today than it was before?
Yeah, I think we've made progress on this. We still need time to really deliver, but we've made a lot of progress in the past years. And digital sovereignty or tech sovereignty is twofold. It is first to have European solutions on the most critical elements of the value chain, the most critical services. And it is second to be in a position to impose our rules in the digital space. be it rules on competition, on fair competition, level playing field, or rules on values, for example. And I think on these two elements we have made progress. I agree that we are not at the end of the, and I would agree that we have not yet fundamentally changed the markets in that respect, but we have set in place what is necessary to do so. On regulations, for example, on DMA, we are just in the phase of sanctions, so we are just in the phase of implementing the regulations, so this is a first step. And on the offer, on the European solutions developments, we have made, I think, a lot of progress with a lot of tools. Lucilla mentioned CHIPS Act. We have IPCIs on cloud and semiconductors. We have increased strongly the semiconductors capacity. And on AI, obviously, with the perspective of AI factories. So I think we have made this much progress. We still have to continue, but we have made progress.
It's interesting, and we're going to unpack some of these because there's a lot at play, I think, in these in the question of how you do taxonomy. But first, I want to offer Alexandre the word because we do need a counter argument here before we fall into a consensus. What is the counter argument to sort of Europe's quest to, start looking inward, build its own technology, and perhaps even shut itself off from the rest of the world?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you so much. The problem with the term sovereignty is that it is inherently a statehood-driven notion. And when we talk about competitiveness, it starts with businesses, the supply side, and it starts also with the demand. When we look at the past, I think that the conversation around tech sovereignty in Brussels, what has changed? That conversation alone, if you drill down into the specifics, maybe the tone has changed, maybe the context certainly has changed. But the conversation, the policy conversations are exactly the same. We can debate about this, but the policy measures that are being addressed are entirely focused on reorganizing the supply side, or chunks of it for parts of the market. And oftentimes, what we've been missing maybe in the past, if we are building tomorrow's agenda, we should, of course, be mindful of today's context in Europe, but we should not repeat the mistakes of the past. In businesses, what businesses ultimately need to make Europe technologically strong, or stronger than it is, because I can tell you some foreign countries, including the United States, has dependencies on European companies. Interdependencies is necessary. I don't think the European companies that are doing very well in the United States should be cut off simply because the US is entirely dependent on those companies. What businesses really need is a single market. I think we've celebrated 32 or 33 years of single markets. It's still a concept, not a reality. And unfortunately, over the last 5 years, perhaps the perverse effect of what we've seen with so many tech regulation, at least in the tech space, is that we have come to situations where now more than ever, our associations is filing comments after comments to the European Commission on what member states is doing, gold-plating existing rules. Then you've got the sheer volume of EU rules alone. I'll give you an example, the AI Act, right? So 2 articles on GPAIs it's just 2 articles, is leading to, so far, 50 to 60 additional rules in the form of code of practice, in the form of guidelines, and potentially a template. I don't know how long the template will be. 2 articles, 70 rules. It gives you a sense of the magnitude of the sheer volume and the complexity of the regulatory landscape we are dealing with, which isn't necessarily helping, I think, European businesses or any businesses that are doing business in Europe.
I'd love to get a little bit into the question of the technology landscape and turn to Christina, because Christina, you were very involved in an initiative called the Eurostack. I believe everyone in this room has heard of Eurostack at this point. Hopefully everyone joining online has heard of Eurostack at this point. However, I do want to ask you to explain it in 1 minute. And then the point that I want to ask you about is, the real question, I guess, is looking at the complexity of the technology sector and looking at sort of how different parts of that sector are at different levels in the supply chain. Where do you see sort of Eurostack producing the first results, the things that Europe can look to as sort of good examples of how a thing like Eurostack can actually produce results?
Thanks for the opportunity. The idea of Eurostack really came out of, again, contemplating these dependencies and contemplating the fact that regulation as it is true, is making progress. But let's be clear, taming big tech does not involve powering Europe. It is not axiomatic that if you somehow control Apple or Amazon, that is going to elevate European companies. So, to your point, nothing is exclusive. We are not, I'm certainly not suggesting that the goals of having a common market, the goal of having fewer barriers are not worthwhile. Absolutely, they're part of the discussion. They're also not an obstacle because companies like Amazon, indeed, like American companies, came into Europe and rolled and created a pan-European business without being too hampered by the actual barriers and the lack of a union. So it is on us, Europeans, to get our act together and power ourselves up, not relying on something done at the regulatory end that takes forever and is not going to make us better. The fundamental principle here is not to eliminate American companies from Europe. We can't. They are too good, and we are dependent to some extent. But the point is, in Draghi's spirit, we have a huge productivity gap. We have a growth problem as Europeans, and we need to somehow generate the conditions for that growth to happen, part of which is also to give European tech companies a space, not on the supply side, on the demand side. They don't want subsidies. They're not going cap in hand with the Commission saying, give me a few billions. They're saying, if I had some demand, I could invest my own money. I can attract VC, I can attract PE. So the spirit here is industry-led, because only if industry leads and makes profit, we can see growth. There is nothing else. You can have civil society, think tanks, and academics going on at length. No one cares. The issue is, does industry have the opportunity to? And that's the only sense in which, to conclude, when you talk about strategic autonomy as a state initiative, I'm not there. I don't want the Commission to lead the development of the European tech industry for the next 30 years. That strikes fear into me. I don't want the Commission to be sitting at a desk in Connect and decide what the European tech industry looks like in 30 years. God
I
help
hope you
us.
have a better expectation.
No, I'm exaggerating, and I'm not suggesting that they're doing. Some are suggesting. There are some versions of Eurostack that say, give us 300 billion, and we will just do it, right? And that isn't going to work unless industry is involved. I'm saying, let's, for example, suggest that part of the procurement demand is directed to European companies. Not all of it, part of it. Is that so strange? This is industrial policy. We need some of it. Americans buy America.
Before we turn to procurement, I do want to ask you, Lucilla, because you've gone through the process with chips. You were in charge of the work at the European Commission on the European Chips Act while it was drafted and when it was implemented. But the European Chips Act has illustrated how hard it is to actually change global value chain, right? And the target of 20% that was set for 2030. Increasingly, it's looking like that is just, out of the question. Two questions. One is, if you were to revise that target today, what would that target be? And then secondly, do you have a sense of why it didn't work with chips, why that sort of industrial policy isn't really producing the results that we were looking for, and how we can then do industrial policy different on areas like AI, for instance?
Well, first, let me say that I'm not responsible for semiconductors anymore right now, so I'm not here to tell you how the target will change. No, I think what happened and why that was very difficult to meet that target is that the market of semiconductors really increased significantly the world market. So if you want to get such a significant share of the market, it means for the European industry or for investments in Europe to grow at a scale which was maybe too high, and so we probably overshot with that target ourselves. I take the responsibility. But I don't think we failed with the CHIPS Act, because I think that what you see in Europe right now is that Europe is stronger in the development of semiconductors. We did attract investment. We have, for example, very interesting investment also in Italy from non-European companies. We have certainly a stronger European industry as the outcome of that. We have the important pilot lines by the research and technology organizations that are going very well. And there are a lot of startups right now also that are designing chips in Europe, and I really hope, first of all, that the conditions will be such that they remain in Europe and that they can scale up to a very important extent. So I don't look negatively at the European semiconductor market in Europe and the European industry. I think it has very, very bright perspective, and also let's not forget that it is also very much led by one very important company, of course, that we have in the European Union for the production of lithography.
Which is ASML, the Dutch dominant player on
ASML, yes, it's originally a spin-off of Philips, and I think it's a very great example of what can be done in Europe. And I think that it's important to have these leaders in Europe, because we need to have leaders to create ecosystems in the technological area. And that's what is also a very important part of the conditions that we have to have in Europe if we want companies to grow. And I think at the moment, this is a bit of a difference we have with the United States. If I look at the world of artificial intelligence, you do see that in the United States, a company like, for example, OpenAI, was able to grow also because of the support in terms of computing capacity that was given by another important company. And the same goes for other AI companies in the United States. And in Europe, we need more of this kind of collaborations of larger companies in our industrial setting, collaborating increasingly more with the smaller ones, especially when developments, like in artificial intelligence, are driven by startups.
Okay. Thomas, let me bring you in because, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to react to share Lucila's view that I wouldn't say that our industrial policy in semiconductors is a failure. I think it has allowed us to make a lot of progress, and I would mention just 3 examples. One, in technology, we have supported the emergence of semiconductors, actors for semiconductors for edge AI, and on these they are competing. Second, for example, in France, we have increased our production capacity by 50%, which is a concrete result. And third, we have attracted important, and we are still hoping to attract important foreign investments in increasing capacities. So I think these are very concrete results. Obviously, current market conditions for semiconductors, for example, in the automotive industry, make it that some investment go maybe slower than expected, but these are market conditions. They will change, and so we are confident it will deliver results.
And so what do you make of the argument that Christina is making that public procurement, for instance, should be directed at European companies? How do you do that at the government level?
Yeah, I think it's clearly an important issue for Europe to tackle European preference, which means indeed that public procurement should allow preference for either for European either products or services, and for including digital services. Obviously, it's easier to define for products for which there are already legal definitions, for example, in the customs code, than for services and digital services. But we are working on it, and we think it's a very important step for the European Commission and EU to take, and it will take place in the revision of the directive on public procurement. And we strongly support this revision to allow for this European preference in public procurement, so which is not feasible today, while all our major competitors either explicitly or implicitly have some national preference.
Mm-hmm. Europe consciously has not had that because it was part of the vision on trade, it was part of the vision of an open economy, etc. And this is, I think, also a question I want to ask, and this is an open question to all of you, but is Europe really sort of questioning its core principles that it built its economy in the past couple of decades? Or is it just adapting to a new situation? Do you stick with the script, or do you throw out the script and write a new one? That's the real question. Maybe, Christina, you want to jump in there?
I wouldn't put it like throwing out the script. But again, the world has changed. Draghi has told us very starkly the situation, the predicament we find ourselves in. Not that we didn't know, by the way, because what Draghi says is a slightly more, in fact, a significantly more urgent version of what Mario Monti said 10 years before. We know what the problems are, but now the urgency is greater because we are in a situation in which the European economy, he says, your social and economic contract is no longer sustainable. Our economic model is premised in the last 20 years on exporting cars, essentially, to China, to the US. This is no longer tenable. China makes more cars than we can ever hope to buy, and the Americans don't want our cars anymore. So exactly, we are squeezed in the middle between the American hammer and the Chinese anvil, and what are we going to do? So in that spirit, what has obviously changed is that we need to be very conscious that when it comes to creating the conditions for European industry to somehow lift itself, because it's been shrinking. It's not as if the digital capabilities Europe has, are improving. Things are shrinking. The share of European cloud in European demand is going down. For the Americans in the room, and when I talk to Americans, the question is simply this. Think of that. Think of a situation in which you in the United States suddenly kind of realize that 80 to 90% of all your cloud needs are served by Europeans. That would be unthinkable, right? You would be running to the White House and say, what are we doing? Let's build. And this is exactly where we are. There is no sentiment other than it's not protectionism, it's not autarky. We had Cloudflare last year, the catastrophic episode that highlighted the dependency. We have the political dependency. If some of this kill switch is turned off, exactly what we do. And we've seen Microsoft coming in last week reassuring Europe, because it's not a fantasy. The question was, don't worry, we will sue the Trump administration if he ever thought that we should do something against Europe. How credible is that? I don't think anyone seriously believed that pledge. So unless you create the conditions, there was a mention of European digital skill gap, of course, because if your industry is shrinking and you export all your best engineers to Silicon Valley, the Middle East, and the Far East, exactly what are you left with? So we need to preserve this capability and invest on that here. I don't think there's any question. People who talk about WTO trade rules, who cares? Who actually cares when we are talking about our security, our resilience, our democracy?
Should we do a raise of hands from the room? Who cares?
Honestly, no. I mean, you speak to trade experts in the US, they say saving Europeans from themselves is a full-time job. Right.
Alexandre, I want to bring you in because the debate on cloud and kill switch, I think, is a very tangible one that's sort of it's a scenario, I think, that really hits home with the European policymaker. The discussion on cloud dependency has been a long one. I remember covering Gaia X way back, and we see where that went. But I do want to ask Alexandre, how do you engage with the Brussels community on the question of a kill switch? What's the response of some of the biggest hyperscalers on whether Europe is actively under threat of having a kill switch on its cloud services?
Yeah, I first of all fully grasp the anxiety of that notion of kill switch because it was literally conveyed by a CEO. I understand that. But the reality is that any business, regardless of their nationality, their first allegiance is with their customers. No customers, no business. Their second allegiance is with their shareholders. When you invest, I don't know, 20 billions every year, or I've seen numbers, I don't remember the Microsoft numbers, but anyway, huge amount of money in building infrastructure here, in building and providing also jobs. It's a commitment to Europe, right? So I understand the anxiety, but we shouldn't drive policy, the long-term policies for tomorrow, for tomorrow, based on emotions.
But Alexandre, sorry. I mean, sorry. I mean, no one is questioning the goodwill and the attachment to customers of the companies. This is not in question. Companies are serious companies and they want to please their customers and they want to serve their customers. That's not in question. What is in question is the political dimension, right? And if that political dimension turns hostile, exactly how credible is it that companies with the best intention can challenge their president? This is what is not credible. So the International Criminal Court in The Hague is one which has been declared outlaw by President Trump with an executive order. It's one pillar of European democracy. What if, at the moment, it's being served by Microsoft? All of the data and files are in Microsoft servers. What if President Trump turns around and says, oh, by the way, I've declared that they are outlaw. What is Microsoft doing serving you? Terminate the contract. I'm not saying a kill switch is going to be something which turns off Europe instantaneously. But there will be targets. There will be ways in which political targets can be weaponized. And what exactly does Microsoft say to President Trump? So, that's the problem.
Let's just close it here, because I think Microsoft, for one, gave a clear response to that last week. The other hyperscalers, we haven't heard as much in terms of addressing that issue very specifically. First of all, I'm going to ask the room for questions. We already have questions. Great, fantastic. In fact, we've got 4 hands. This is not on the question of WTO respected or not. These are other questions. Do we have a mic running around? Fantastic. So if you would hand the mic, raise your hand, please, if you have a question. Let's take the lady in the white first. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Veronika Möller, Managing Director of Mover Consulting and podcast host of Transatlantic Tech Talk. I would like to try to reconcile your arguments. Thank you for the very lively debate. I'm consulting businesses and startups among them. So I think there are great opportunities in Europe, but what would you like to tell them why they shouldn't reshore to the US right now? What are the core principles and what are the reasons that still make it worthwhile to stay in Europe? Thank you.
That's a good question. Who wants to take it?
I'm happy to take them all, but I don't know.
Toma, I think you want to come in.
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of reasons. First, Europe is doing a lot, even last week, to attract and keep talents. And last week, the President of the Commission and President Macron launched an initiative to continue to attract the highest level research talents in Europe. I wouldn't mention that, obviously, Europe will stay for a long time a major market on which you have to be if you want a world development. And then I would add all the steps we have taken, the regulatory steps in which, for startups in particular, regulations such as DMA, DSA will provide a better level playing field for their development. And these startups specifically need that kind of level playing field and market conditions, but also all the support that can be brought for innovation in all the programs I mentioned, but also all the efforts we're making on funding. And we acknowledge the fact that funding for startups is still a challenge in Europe for scale-ups. in particular, but we have taken some initiatives such as European Tech Champion Initiative in 2022, and we're still working on EIC, for example, to provide better funding for startups. So I think the ecosystem will remain very supportive for startup development, aside from market perspectives.
Yeah, just to add very briefly, that also there is a reflection on the 28th regime for startups is going to be very important for their scale up in the single market. And very soon the Commission will actually publish a startup and scale up strategy, which will address all the different issues, financing, and other issues that concern startups. But we see that there is a very vibrant ecosystem for startups, and that's very important to observe in the European Union right now.
Mm-hmm. Alexandre?
So if the question is, what do we tell unicorns to make sure that they stay actually in Europe and we keep that potential in Europe? The one thing I'm not hearing right now is a commitment to simplifications. This is a political commitment that has been made under this new commission, and I think any unicorns will, they have already scratched their head a number of times. Some of them have left the European Union just because the European Union, it's a great idea, but right now it's not. Again, the single market is a concept, not a reality. And like the brain power and the resources that will be required to make meaningful simplification, I know it's a challenge. The Commission has a stock of position papers and suggestions in various departments, identifying frictions, areas for where interpretation, there could be further interpretation. It just goes on and on. I think some organization, Business Europe, if I'm not mistaken, has 150 long pages of documents of things that need to be fixed. We have identified roughly 25, 26 legislation that needs fixing. What do we see? Just one last point. What do we see now coming in terms of like the signals so far? Maybe it's too early to judge what we're getting in terms of simplification, but the signals we're getting aren't the most promising. GDPR. Now there's talks about removing the lowest hanging fruit, the sort of the least difficult obligation of keeping a record of your processing activities for companies that are between 250 employees and 500 employees. Do you know how many of those companies we have in Europe? Less than 0.2%. If that's GDPR simplification, there's a disconnect between the political commitments and what we may end up on the table. And there's so much low-hanging fruit from the European Commission. I know for a fact they can do so much more on GDPR without fundamentally rechanging anything. The spirit is good. GDPR predates the directive of 1995, even the French data protection rules from 1978. We can build on that.
So let's see if we can get a commitment on AI, because Kilian Gross, who works for the AI office, yesterday said that the Commission is open to targeted changes, is how he framed it. Lucila, are you open to targeted changes, and how broad or targeted can those changes be?
Yes, I mean, first of all, I have to say that the political commitment to simplification is very clear. So I don't understand why this is now put under discussion. For example, also for the digital legislation, by the end of the year, there will be also a proposal. We are looking into all the different pieces of legislation that we have in the digital world. And we are also looking at the AI Act, but we are not going to revise the AI Act. We are not going to change it. We only want to make sure that it is simple to implement, that the red tape is, basically eliminated as much as possible. And I find, sorry if I may, but I find some discussions a little bit funny, because here I had to hear the criticism to the fact that we're doing the code of practice, which is the one that Joshua Benjo was referring to earlier. Well, the code of practice is an instrument. It's not another piece of legislation emanating from one article of the AI Act. It's a voluntary instrument, a practical instrument for companies to comply with the obligations. The guidelines are explaining concepts of the AI Act. So we are really into an effort of also offering a lot of certainty, a lot of practical way of compliance discussed with stakeholders, and I don't think that these should be treated as an extra piece of regulation, because they're not. They're really there to simplify and support the compliance with the regulation.
But so no changes, no revision, no changes.
Well, I don't expect to have revisions of the AI Act. The AI Act started and entered in force a year ago. But we are looking if we can make it simpler, of course, in particular for smaller companies, but we're also looking into the relations with other pieces of legislation, because this is what is complicated very often, is the alignment with different pieces of legislation. Can we facilitate compliance, machinery regulation, the AI Act, the GDPR AI Act, and we'll come forward not necessarily with changes in the legislation, it can also be guidelines and more clarity on how we can make, in practice, this legislation work together.
Okay, we've got about 5 minutes left. I want to get as many questions in as I can. I've got the sir in the front, and then I've got 2 hands up in the back, in the green, and yes.
Hi, Moritz Möller. I'm with Global Foundries, a US semiconductor company. And my question was a bit superseded by the discussion, so it will be a bit more of a statement, but just to pick up on a few points. First of all,
we hope it's a snappy statement then.
I will be short, yes, I'm German, so first of all, competitiveness. We work with many startups as a company. And now I can give you several examples of startups we are working with now moving to the US, simply because they say there's too much bureaucratic red tape here in Europe and we don't have access to capital. And I mean, we have all the information in the competitive compass. Average competitiveness in Europe versus the US is 70%. Another example from our industry, what did South Korea do? Average working hour, 52 hours. They now increased the working limit to 62 hours in the semiconductor industry, simply because they say we need to be more competitive. And last point, of course, energy prices. I mean, there's so many issues. Everyone knows what the problems are to be competitive. It's on us now to get things done. But it's not as complicated as it seems.
Great, thank you. I will hand the mic to the back. I've got the 2 hands up, and I believe the lady in green has been up for a while, and then we'll go to you after.
Hello, I'm Laura. I work for All Digital, pan-European organization working on digital skills. Mrs. Carafa talked about competitiveness, but briefly mentioned the lack of digital skills in Europe. I guess it's also like the issue of upskilling of already skilled people and just getting them on track on AI and developed technologies. But also there are 44% of the Europeans that lack basic digital skills. And I wonder how this issue fits into this conversation of European competitiveness. Thank you.
Any thoughts on skills? Yeah. And we just, yeah, yes.
Yeah, we've been trying to address that issue in France, for example, for AI by financing 9 AI clusters in which we make attractive, which develops training capacities, increased training capacities for AI specialists, and we have doubled since we started our strategy the number of diplomas for AI specialists in, that are being trained in France. There is also an issue on attracting talents from abroad that is part of it, and we have, for example, a special visa for talents to come to France. So we think I agree that we need to increase training capacity and the number of skills. Also, we have programs in implementing AI in other training programs to have an AI dimension in all training programs. And it's mostly a question of implementing training capacities, increasing the number of diplomas, and I think we should continue to do so in the coming years.
I'm very happy that you came with the French pitch and very well prepared, both on this and on the question of startups, I believe. We do have a question. Victoria in green, yes?
Thank you very much. I'm Victoria de Besson, the Secretary General of the European Tech Alliance, which represents European-born and bred companies. So all my members are founded and grow in Europe. I think we're right by saying that the time of naivety is over, but we also need to be realistic about our capacity in Europe and what we can do. What I hear a lot from my CEOs, so I have CEOs from very large company, Booking.com, Spotify, Zalando would be the biggest one, but you would also know maybe small ones like AppDropper, HelloWorks, so just representing small, medium, and large European ones. What they keep saying is, one, we need to strengthen the single market. Two, we need to focus on enforcement. All the rules need to apply to everybody in the same way. Three, take simplification seriously. So very happy to hear, Lucia, that you say alignment between EU rules, because this is critical. And then four, developing a strategy that goes beyond startup and scale-ups. Because today what we are seeing, and what Mario Draghi said in his report, we've got lots of startups, we've got lots of scale-ups, but it's the next phase that's challenging. And to Catriona, your comment, the difference between European and American is when American enter the European market, they're already a lot more mature, they have had time to grow. We as European, we are stuck in our little countries with different interpretations, and sometimes national authorities have different interpretation of a similar piece. Data is one example. So my question, and it's slightly more concrete, is what concrete step would you recommend that the European Union should take, or the member state like France should take, to make sure that European innovators have the capacity to grow beyond that startup and scale-up phase? Because the startup and scale-up strategy, amazing, but we also need help for the more medium and large ones to be able to compete globally. Thank you.
Short thoughts?
Well, again, for the startups and the scale-ups is the 28th regime that I mentioned earlier that should facilitate the fact that they can test their products and their services in different countries. That's what normally it's more complicated for them to do. Also, we are doing efforts to make sure that the funding, the capital funding, is not only national. We do that, of course, with efforts of the European Investment Fund and European Investment Bank, but also working with member states. I think in the capital union is going to be essential and key for making sure that there is more, beyond the national capital funding available, and therefore the amounts that are really needed, for example, in artificial intelligence, but also in other areas, the capital needed is significant and cannot just be relying on the provisions of companies in one single country. And the bigger companies, I think the European Commission has also mentioned the fact that we will be looking at maybe also simplifying the rules for what we call the small mid-caps. So for slightly bigger companies, that is an important possibility that we are reflecting on. And generally speaking, greater integration through the capital union and through the data union, because we are talking about digital, that we will be doing in the future will certainly be very important for all companies to operate in the European single market.
I fear that is all the time we have. I do apologize for those who didn't get the chance to ask a question, but I want to thank our panelists for a fun discussion, a vibrant discussion, and I want to ask the audience to stay seated because our next session will begin right after this. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay.
I think we go to